So, we're going to start our afternoon session. Our first topic for the afternoon is Weed Out, Conflicts and Conflict-Solving Strategies. I will go straight forward to our first speaker, Professor Peter Stone, UNESCO Chair in Cultural Property Protection and Peace at Newcastle University. He is also the president of Blue Shield International. Professor Stone has been working with military and humanitarian sectors since 2003 for the protection of cultural property in conflict. He has written extensively on this topic, including co-editing The Destruction of Cultural Heritage in Iraq and editing Cultural Heritage, Ethics and the Military. His article, The Four-Tier Approach, published in the British Army Review, was a stimulus for the establishment of the new Cultural Property Protection Unit in UK forces. Today, his topic is World Heritage Sites, Targets in Conflicts, Ambassadors for Peace. Professor Stone, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It always makes me nervous when people clap before I've spoken, as to you don't know what I'm just about to say. Thank you to the organisers for A, organising this, and B, inviting me. Thank you for letting me speak in English, which is the only language I could speak to you in. And also, just a warning, we are talking about conflict and peace. There is one image that I'm going to show you which emphasises the conflict bit of that, for which I apologise beforehand, but it drives home a point. So, the presentation there, that's the title, that's what I'm going to be talking about. And what? Yeah, thank you. We all know about the destruction of cultural heritage and World Heritage sites. We know about the Bamyan Buddhas, we know about the bridge at Mostar, and we know about the intention of the reconstruction of some of these. The debate about the Buddhas going on, the debate there about Mostar, showing the reconstructed bridge as a symbol of reconciliation, etc. But is rebuilding the bridge enough? We all know about Palmyra, and there are endless debates, of which I'm sure you're involved and aware of, about what to do with the image that is no longer there, that you've got on your screen, the now destroyed Temple of Baal. Interesting, two of those sites were not World Heritage sites when they were blown up, and were only inscribed after the event, which is an interesting nuance on the whole concept of World Heritage and authenticity, which I'm going to gloss over. So we all know the problems in terms of conflict. Let me just take you back a little bit to people who knew the problems of conflict even better than we do. Those people who had lived through 2 world wars in the last century. And essentially, the First World War was caused by the failure of royalty across Europe to avert the war. At the end of that war, the international community therefore got together to create the League of Nations. And the League of Nations, dramatically oversimply, was there to produce peace through political and economic means. And that failed catastrophically with the advent of the Second World War. So the International Committee got together again, rethought the process, disbanded the League of Nations, but created the United Nations system, and in particular UNESCO. And with UNESCO's image, and I'm not going to read everything out on the screen, but with since wars beginning the minds of men, as was written at the time. But most importantly, UNESCO took the whole agenda a major step forward by introducing humanity's moral and intellectual solidarity being a key element of everything that it did. So moving on from just the politics and economics of the League of Nations. And that was exemplified in the Nuremberg trials, where senior Nazis were prosecuted and convicted for crimes against cultural, in the language of the time, cultural property, okay, what we would today call heritage. It was there epitomised in Article 27 of access to culture and heritage in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was also there, and most fascinatingly, and a discussion which framed nearly everything else on that slide, the 1948 Genocide Convention. And that was first drafted by a character called Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jew who escaped Poland just in time. The rest of his family were all killed in the extermination camps. But Lemkin had already started thinking about this concept, which he had to create the word genocide, in relation to the 1915 and 16 genocide of Armenians during the First World War. And then, of course, he worked in America, and everything brought central stage with the Holocaust. But Lemkin identified two forms of genocide: barbarism and vandalism. Barbarism, genocide against people. Vandalism, which frequently determined barbarism, vandalism, genocide against their cultural property or their heritage. And it was that genocide that would come before barbarism. In the final draft of the convention, vandalism was forced out by the so-called settler governments of Australia, the US, New Zealand, Canada, supported by ex-colonial powers like the UK, because they thought that it would be used against them and their treatment of indigenous communities. So it was there as what everybody wanted to see, but taken out because of that issue. It was there absolutely key in the development of the 1954 Hague Convention on the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict, and both of its later protocols. And those who drafted the 54 Convention expected, and I quote, to create a Red Cross for cultural property, which they referred to as the blue and white shield. And if you see bottom left, why they called it the blue and white shield. And that's what they expected to happen, a sister organisation, because they all saw, from living through those two world wars, the indivisibility of protection of people and the protection of their heritage. We all know this. I'm going to run through this really quickly, but why is cultural property important? It provides the tangible and intangible link to the past. It gives people a sense of identity, a sense of place, a sense of dignity. But it also, of course, defines who people are, who belongs and who does not belong, who is included and who is excluded. And it is from that that conflict comes in many cases. It should be a key part of thinking, policy and practice of all what we call in Blue Shield the uniform, so not only the armed forces, but border, customs, police, other emergency services, humanitarian and heritage sectors. It is a fundamental plank of building, in Blue Shield language, healthy, peaceful, stable, sustainable communities. And that's the basis for the same level at society level. In 2003, when I first became involved in this, the International Committee of the Red Cross had lost that link that it was there in 1954 and were not interested. They only wanted to deal with protection of people. They didn't want to protect old things. Preparation is key, is absolutely fundamental. You cannot protect cultural property properly once a conflict has started. You have to do it in peacetime. I can give you good examples of that. I haven't got time to do that now. But you have to develop partnership and trust between those three points of that pyramid: humanitarian, heritage and uniform sectors. They have to work together within the pyramid to deliver good cultural property protection. So, the image that you don't want to see. But it is exemplified in this image from the village of Brocko in former Yugoslavia during the fighting there. The protagonists took the population of the village about 2 miles away from the village to the side of a trench that they had just dug and machine gunned them into the trench. But the trench was then not refilled by the earth that had been taken out to build the trench or to dig the trench. It was filled up with the rubble of their mosque. And the mosque was destroyed, as an archaeologist I would say, down to natural, so there was no possibility of an archaeologist going in 5 days or 500 years' time to say, yes, there was a mosque here before. There was no evidence of the mosque at all, and they moved all of the material from the mosque and buried it together with the people. You cannot get a better example of the indivisibility of the protection of both people and their heritage. The Yazidi have suffered exactly the same fate at the hands of the so-called Islamic State. Most recently, the Rohingya refugees in refugee camps outside Myanmar were asked what was the biggest contribution to their problems with mental health. 73% of them said it was the loss of their heritage, both tangible and intangible. 73%. This is something that is now beginning to attract and understand, as the quote at the bottom of that slide shows from Yves Dacour when we were in Geneva with him signing an MOU between the Blue Shield and the ICRC in 2020. You can't divide them. So, the Blue Shield, only 42 years late, was created in 1996 as an international NGO under Dutch law and really only effectively organised since 2014. And it has sort of three elements: the founding four heritage organisations, ICOM, ICOMOS, IFLA and ICA. It has now 30 national committees globally, with a further 15 under preparation. And together they establish an international board, and with that board, funded through my UNESCO chair as the other logo on there at Newcastle University, create the Secretariat of the Blue Shield. And Newcastle University is therefore the biggest financial contributor to the Blue Shield globally at the moment, which is a bizarre situation for one university to take that on. Let me turn to the other side of what I'm trying to talk about, peace. And UNESCO has global priorities, absolutely credible global priorities of Africa and gender equality. And it has, under its third strategic objective, the development of peaceful societies. It's not quite their forefront. UNESCO has 6 cultural conventions. If we had time, I'd make you guess how many of those actually mention UNESCO's primary function as established in 1945 for the creation of a global peace in climate. Only one of them does. The 2005 Cultural Diversity Convention. It's only in Article 1, subparagraph C, and that's it. At the end of the sentence, and the culture of peace. And that's one of 9 objectives. If we go to the 72 Convention, I'm not going to go through the statistics there, but UNESCO's most successful convention doesn't mention the word peace in the convention at all. But my argument is there are potentially 1,154 ambassadors for peace in those World Heritage sites. UNESCO's World Heritage Mission, again, I'm not going to read this out, you probably all know it, but again, there is one word missing. That missing idea. There is no mention of peace in the nomination process, in the operational guidelines, in the management plans. Presentation and interpretation at sites is all about the history, archaeology or natural environment that site was inscribed for. So in terms of a site that I used to be chairman of, Hadrian's Wall, there are 11 sites along the wall that interpret the wall. They do so in terms of 3 things. the Roman Empire, the Roman frontier, and the Roman army. And the only way you can differentiate where you are in one of those 11 places is the balance of Roman army to Roman Empire at that particular place.
Recording in progress.
There is very, very rarely a mention of UNESCO or peace, or actually World Heritage, at any World Heritage site. One glaring example, the now appallingly out-of-date kit World Heritage in Young
Recording
Hands,
stopped.
which had 4 chapters of focus, one of which was on a culture of peace. And that is desperately in need of revising and desperately in need of expanding in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, climate change, etc. But it's there, and there's a little toehold in the process. So if I can paraphrase an ex-US president, what the World Heritage sites should be doing is not asking what UNESCO can do for them, but what they can do for UNESCO's primary goal and primary objective, peace. At Hadrian's Wall, I eventually persuaded one of those 11 places, when they were redoing their exhibition at Tully House in Carlisle, to include something called the Living Wall. And this is a wall that looks at boundaries, barriers, walls through time and across the world, starting with the Great Wall of China, the Berlin Wall, the so-called Peace Wall in Belfast, walls I'd never knew existed in Africa, and others. And the question about all of those was, do these things ever deliver what the people who asked them to be built wanted them to do? And the exhibition doesn't answer that, but in the terminology of Freeman Tilden, the great interpreter, one of the things that interpretation should do is provoke people to think, and that's what we were trying to do. And without payment, we got at the end of the first week a response from one of those visitors. That, to me, is good interpretation. That, to me, was questioning World Heritage and peace in the context of Hadrian's Wall. Every World Heritage site could do that if they turn their mind to it. Every single one of them is my premise. We started this off pre-COVID in 2019. We did a desktop review of the documentation relating to all of the cultural and mixed World Heritage sites, just over 800. And we've just finished one for the natural sites and mixed
Recording
sites.
in progress.
160 of them referenced peace, but only within their attributes and statements of significance. Only 16 of the 1,154 specifically acknowledged UNESCO's founding objectives. 6 of these were in the UK, and when I questioned that, they said, Pete, you have been going on about this in the UK for the last decade. Are you surprised? You should be really brassed off that only 6 of them have heard the message. We pushed this forward post-COVID with a research project interviewing 16 out of the 33 World Heritage sites, asking them what they did, what was stopping them doing anything more, and what might help them. Very few of them were doing anything about explicitly promoting peace. Several were talking about things like interchanges between different cultures, but there was a general interest in thinking about and sorting out what they might do. But the barriers were really interesting. There was no clear obligation or policy guidance to mention UNESCO and or peace in any of the presentation or interpretation at sites. They didn't really understand what the promotion of peace meant. There was no good examples. They didn't know what the benefit of pushing UNESCO or World Heritage or peace would be to them, to their site. And there was a lack of resources and some much more pressing priorities. So we are now halfway through a project in the UK. At the beginning of the year, we had an initial workshop to go through those responses, to think about what people might be able to do. We provided some support material that they can put on their websites, that we can put on leaflets to give away or temporary exhibitions. We are going through with those 16 sites a pilot project where they are looking at how they can, for their particular site, introduce the concept of peace. We're having a final workshop in March of next year, and all of this will be put together in a report and an academic publication. There are really good links across to a number of SDGs on this. I haven't got time to go through all of that. So my end question to you is, does World Heritage contribute to UNESCO's primary mission? And one I haven't put up there is, and if not, why not? And it's a pity that some of the people at the front aren't here at the moment. Could it to in the future, and will it? And the will it is to those of you who are in the room who have responsibility for World Heritage sites for whatever reason in your day job. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Stone, to share with us your insights and experience, links, also observations you have with the Blue Shirt International and Newcastle. I'm sure there are certainly more to be done and more can be done to enhance the relevance of World Heritage with the peace mandate. But we keep this question, please, we cultivate the questions, and we will have a discussion later, so please take an active part in it. Our next speaker today in the afternoon is Mr. Adam Markham. He is Acting Director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, USC, in Cambridge, USA. Mr. Markham was the leader author for the UNESCO UNEP UCS report, World Heritage and Tourism in Changing Climate in 2016. He was also the lead coordinator on climate impacts for the 2019 ICOMOS report, The Future of Our Past. He is a member of ICOMOS International Committee on Archaeological Heritage Management. Today, his topic is World Heritage and Climate Change. What needs to be done? Mr. Markham, the floor is yours.
Hello, and thank you. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you for inviting me. I work at the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is an NGO, civil society, based in the United States. It's actually 3 years older than the World Heritage Convention, founded in 1969 to work on global nuclear security issues. Since then, it's expanded. We work on food and environment, clean transportation, scientific integrity, and climate and energy, and that's the program that I represent. We have 500,000 members, mainly in the US. So I'm going to talk today about climate and heritage, moving from conflict to solutions around a new global issue. And climate change is really the fastest growing global threat to world heritage. And we have to ask ourselves, well, are there any World Heritage sites that are not affected by climate change? You might think that only a few are, but probably every site is affected by climate change, because you think of changing in seasonality, changing in temperatures, many affected by sea level rise. So there's change all around, even in internal environments as a result of climate change. But are some World Heritage sites more impacted than others? Absolutely yes. And so it's our need and responsibility to try to find out which are most at risk and try to deal with that. We need to understand the vulnerability and the adaptive capacity. So just were mentioned these couple of reports that I was involved in over the last few years, one led by UNESCO and the other by ICOMOS. There's a lot of material in there, but I think one of the key lessons that comes from both of them is that climate change and the impacts of climate change and increasing resilience need to be a core heritage capacity in our community. Another issue which Joe King referred to earlier today is the gaps around the nature-culture issue. So we're not just talking about national parks and protected areas or historic monuments and sites, but we're also talking about intangible cultural heritage. And we need to break down the barriers that are seen between nature and culture, and that is kind of exacerbated by the way that the criteria in the convention are organized between nature and culture. But there's probably not any natural World Heritage Site that doesn't have cultural aspects to it, whether or not that's in the OUV. And yet we only have 4% of current World Heritage Sites being mixed sites with both natural and cultural criteria, and that really creates a barrier to engaging in management. So what does World Heritage face in the future? Well, the future is unpredictable. It's not just climate. We've heard it's conflict and a whole range of other issues. But we can't any longer rely on saying the climate is going to be the same when we put our management plans into place. We certainly will see much more degradation of OUV, and some sites will completely lose their OUV. We've seen in the last few years the debate about the Great Barrier Reef in Australia being impacted by climate change, and that's been very difficult to absorb into the convention's discussions. And we also have to recognize that climate change adds to and worsens existing threats. That's why the report we did linked climate change with sustainable tourism. Those two things can exacerbate each other, but also urbanization, resource extraction, a whole range of the traditional threats that World Heritage comes under. So in recent years, there's been an increasing flood, if you like, of reports and papers and academic studies looking at some of the impacts to World Heritage Sites globally. And just a few here. From 2016, the Potsdam Institute looked at low-lying and coastal World Heritage Sites and found that 132 of 700 were at risk at some level from sea level rise. A more recent study found 42 of 49 coastal Mediterranean World Heritage Sites at risk from coastal erosion. 2 or 3 years ago, IUCN did a report on glaciers, looking at how they would be affected. And just again yesterday, UNESCO and IUCN published a new report on glaciers, and that says that we could lose a third of World Heritage glaciers by 2050. And there are over 18,000 glaciers in World Heritage Sites, and 10% of the glacialized water in the world is held in glaciers. Sorry, that's my American and British accent getting mixed up, held in glaciers in World Heritage Sites. Also, there's been a big report that's also been updated on coral reefs. And this is kind of one of the depressing things about the fact we're unlikely to meet the Paris target of 1.5C, is that 90% of living coral reefs, not just in World Heritage Sites, would eventually be lost if we don't hit 1.5. So if you need a reason to hit 1.5 versus 2, you have it just there in coral reefs, not just for the biodiversity and the importance in ecosystems, but for the importance in economy and culture. And then another recent paper was on Arctic archaeological sites, which found that 180,000 archaeological sites in the Pan-Arctic region are likely to be at risk from climate change. That's from warming soils, melting permafrost, massive coastal erosion, and also tourist development in a warming world. So I'll just run quickly through a few. You've heard all of these climate impacts before, but sea level rise, coastal erosion and flooding are the things that people talk most about, and here are some of the World Heritage Sites, plus one that's not in Scotland, that are affected in various ways by climate change. But it's not just on the coasts. Inland and river flooding is increasing, along with increased extreme weather events. So we saw big floods in Paris in 2016, but also in dryland areas like the Meroe Pyramids in Sudan. One of the top-ranked climate risks to that site is actually flooding from the Nile. On the other side of the equation is drought, aridification, and wildfires. The wildfire season in the western United States is now 2 months longer during the year than it was in the 1970s, and the size of wildfires is increasing radically, and the severity of fires. On the bottom right, you see a picture of a tundra fire in Alaska. These fires are now reaching the size that has not been recorded for over 5,000 years in the paleoecological data. Another thing that we're looking at is earthen buildings and ancient masonry. Many World Heritage sites have this kind of architecture, and you can see that there are changes from extreme precipitation and flooding. Down at the bottom you see Tumakakori, one of the national park sites in the US. There the maintenance costs are increasing and the walls are collapsing as a result of more extreme rainfall. On the right you see Angkor in Cambodia, and the masonry there is cracking and destabilizing buildings because of a combination of changes in rainfall patterns and over-extraction of groundwater for tourism development. So there's a very good example of the combination of climate change and uncontrolled tourism development leading to impacts. Rock art, too, not talked about so much when we hear about climate change, but in the top left you see the Tasmanian wilderness in Australia, where the Aboriginal rock art is threatened by sea level rise. In other places we have threats of biological damage, wind abrasion, and fire damage in particular, which can flake off rocks and crack rocks, is an increasing issue for rock art. So coming now to some of the recommendations that are beginning to come out about World Heritage and climate change. This is a report that has only recently been published. It was the results of a joint IPCC, ICOMOS, UNESCO expert meeting on climate change and culture last year, published this year. It's actually not very easy to find online, but you should find it. It's full of amazing stuff, and there's 3 white papers that go with it. I just pulled some of the key conclusions that I found really important from it to put up here. One of the things that it identifies is that our understanding of global climate impacts on cultural heritage is very much biased by our looking at monuments and sites and buildings, and also by the famous sites. And so in a sense, World Heritage contributes to that by having so many iconic places. Secondly, the need to acknowledge the equal importance of different ways of knowing. So we, and my organization is prime in doing this. We put Western science first, but we need to be braiding that in with indigenous and local knowledge, and that hasn't been done effectively so far. And the views and perspectives of local and indigenous communities need to be included in vulnerability assessments for properties and sites, and those assessments will become much better when that's happened. And those stakeholders also need to be provided, and I think this comes back with Joe King, to what Joe King was saying earlier, they need to be provided platforms in the policy-making fora where these decisions about climate action and management are being taken, and not to be interpreted through people like me going to conferences and saying this is happening to indigenous communities here, but to provide the indigenous communities their own platform to speak for themselves about their own ways of acting and knowing. And then finally, and this is sort of on my mind because COP27 is coming up in just a few days in Egypt, the issue of loss and damage and the international negotiations to bring climate finance relief and support to less developed countries who've suffered impacts. That debate is missing the intangible cultural heritage piece of the discussion, because non-economic loss and damage is kind of lumped in there as something that is also really bad but because we can't economically value it, we'll deal with that later. And so I think that this issue of non-economic loss and damage in the international negotiations is crucial. Wanted to put a few lessons for World Heritage Management, and probably many of you are already implementing these or know about them, but it's worth restating a few of them. We do really need standardized and transparent vulnerability assessments across all World Heritage sites, and then we need to redo them in a few years' time as the climate continues to change and as management strategies are assessed. And then we need to monitor the change. I've been involved in the development with scientists from James Cook University in Australia of the Climate Vulnerability Index, which we've used as a pilot to make assessments in some World Heritage sites, including in Orkney in Scotland and Vega in Norway. And so we're trying to find ways to do this that can work across natural and cultural sites and which are transparent to everybody and can be repeated in a standardized way. It kind of goes without saying, but we need to integrate climate change into planning. It's not being done in many cases. And we need to plan and manage for change, not static conditions. And in doing that, we have to use the most plausible climate scenarios. And that's easy in a country like the US or the United Kingdom or Germany, where there are great scientific facilities available. But in a lot of countries, there isn't a lot of updated, local, downscaled climate information available. And so it's an area that could benefit from capacity building to make that, not to bring in the Western scientists, but to make that capacity available locally in the countries. We need, as I said, to embrace local, traditional and indigenous knowledge, and then we need to align local and management authority plans so that one is not working against the other. Often we see a local community try to do something differently from what a management authority or what the local county or region wants to do. And then it's been spoken about just now on public interpretation, but we do need much more public interpretation on climate change. And I know there are some initiatives out there, but there need to be more. Coming back to COP27 now, in the UNFCCC, the convention, nations are required to come up with a national adaptation plan, and they can lodge those plans with the Secretariat. And so recently, Kathy Daly at Lincoln University has done an assessment with colleagues of the national adaptation plans for less developed countries which have been lodged. And of those low and middle income countries, only 17 of the 30 even mention heritage, and only 3 of those plans actually have actions in them to safeguard and manage heritage. And so that, to me, sort of just highlights the gap that there is between the heritage community, the World Heritage Convention, and what's happening at the national level in responding to the UNFCCC needs. And I think every time in the World Heritage Committee, we hear that, yes, climate change is really to be dealt with in the UNFCCC. Well, that's fine if you can link the two, but they're not being effectively linked right now, and they absolutely need to be. And then another thing in this report was identifying some of the institutional barriers to adaptation, which include lack of coordination between environment and culture strategies, and again, that's the lack of linkage, lack of training, funding, capacity, political support, and I've just added science into that. So, getting to my conclusions now. After 50 years of the convention, what needs to happen? So, in 1972, climate change wasn't envisaged as one of the kinds of threats that the convention would deal with. It's a threat that can't be fully addressed by the nation, the state party, or the region. It has to be addressed globally. And so just that fact that that kind of threat wasn't envisaged at the beginning is hamstringing us now as we try to address it today, because the way the convention is set up, as we've seen with the Great Barrier Reef, doesn't effectively deal with climate change. And in doing that, we have to look at, well, what does it mean if the OUV of some sites, or many sites, is going to be damaged or potentially lost? Yes, we might put the Great Barrier Reef on the endangered list, but are we going to put another 200 sites on the endangered list over the next 20 years, another 1,000 sites? Oh gosh, there's only 1154 sites there. So how will we deal with the danger of climate change and the endangered list? There has to be a change there. We're going to need changes in the operational guidelines and probably modifications to the way we do reactive monitoring missions, and that certainly means increasing the expertise on climate change and resilience and climate adaptation that go on reactive monitoring missions. We need to reassess issues of authenticity in the context of climate change, both in mitigation of climate change, reducing emissions at sites. Buildings are a core source of emissions, but also in adapting and responding to climate change. For example, putting shelters over archaeological sites. And then finally, we need to, and this is really something that Mechthild Rössler has talked about a lot, is adapt and adopt learning about change and fluidity from cultural landscapes, because cultural landscapes have developed over time with local and indigenous knowledge. They are essentially models of adaptation and resilience in changing conditions of all sorts. And then my final slide, again, just with COP27 in mind, is about leveraging World Heritage for climate action. I haven't talked about it at all, but there's a lot of wilderness and natural marine and forest areas in World Heritage sites. Certainly IUCN has highlighted this in a lot of its work, but the carbon storage potential of World Heritage sites is very high, and this is a great argument for maintaining and managing those World Heritage sites, that they are contributing to reducing the climate problem. I've already said we need to recognize intangible cultural heritage more, and I've also said that we want to inform and educate and mobilize visitors. The key point here on this slide, I think, is using the public power of World Heritage status to leverage climate action. So coming back to the iconic nature of World Heritage, can we use that to get people more motivated and get states parties more motivated to take action? The first several versions of the IPCC report talked a lot about places that were impacted by climate change, but in almost no case did they mention that they were World Heritage sites. So to go through all of the IPCC reports and pull out all the World Heritage sites that are affected but haven't been mentioned, that would show people much more strongly what they stand to lose. And that, I think, is where the community of heritage professionals can come in. So, and at that point, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Markham, for sharing with us lots of updated data and reports, and also to bring the needs of climate vulnerability assessment in the convention. So thank you very much for both our speakers, Professor Stone and Mr. Markham. They both showed us shocking pictures and also raised intriguing questions on the significant threats facing World Heritage sites, which is climate change and conflicts. In this spirit, I would like to open our dialogues with our participants in person here and also online. Before that, I would like to invite our speakers from the previous roundtable to join us, and also Professor Stone and Mr. Markham, please come back to the podium. And I would like to invite Mr. Joseph King is not here, and Mr. Matthias Riep, please, and Mr. Uli Grabner, Mrs. Christina Anna, and Mrs. Constance Fuhrmann. Please join us on the stage. I would also to ask if Professor Christina Cameron is online to join us for the discussion. Thank you. It's great to see you again. And Yeah, Mrs. Constance Fuhrmann, can I ask you to join us? So thank you very much for all our speakers and participants online and in person. And we have already explained, if you have questions, please use the question and answers function in the plenary room. And we have a coordination team to collect and summarize your questions and concerns. And also, I would like to give the floor to our audience sitting in this Europa Saal. If you have any questions, or if you want to particularly address your questions to a particular speaker, this is the time now. Any questions? So I would also ask our coordination team, any collections? Right, we have already one. So I will start with our online participants. There is a question addressed to Professor Cameron. How can, in future, our World Heritage influence the World Heritage system?
Thank you for that question. It's a very important one, and I do think that's some of the discussion that we're going to have in the next couple of weeks is about how then to make that link. You've heard earlier that the World Heritage inner processes don't really offer an opportunity for civil society and local community representatives to engage in the process. So the question is, how do we do that in a distributed fashion? And I think Joe raised that question. I think it's an absolutely essential one. I think our identification as a foundation is pretty clear what we want to do. The question is, how do we then have that influence? Is it going to be at the level of trying to influence states parties? Is it going to be acting in the co-learning and advancing practice side of organizing on platforms the training and the awareness sharing, not necessarily staying in that inner circle? I'm not very confident about having a big impact on the World Heritage processes, particularly the committee, because I don't think they have the time to do that. If ever there is a major reorganization of how the World Heritage system unfolds each year at its sessions, and if they ever divide it into a two-part session, which has been much discussed about having a pre-World Heritage Committee session of expert civil society and so on, having that dialogue before the committee and having that worked into the decision-making, that might be an opportunity. But it may be that the more influential and practical way forward is going to be working outside that inner circle and trying to reach out directly to the World Heritage sites.
Thank you, Professor Cameron, for illustrate the potentials to do so. I think Mr. Joe King also in his speech emphasized there are two systems, internal ones and outside ones, and both need to be strengthened of the cooperation to influence the future. And I would also like to ask our experts on the podium, anything that from your perspective that you want to bring it in for that? Yes, Mr. Captain.
I can just add that I was made aware, it was not my thought, but I was made aware in the break that the World Heritage Convention is not alone with this problem. So how to involve civil society in these high-level governmental conventions better could be something that needs to be thought on a legal expert level, on a much higher level, and then try to see how we can wave it into UNESCO's conventions.
Can I just add one point to that? I think we also need to expand the civil society groups that are working on and understanding World Heritage. I think what I've really come into this from the climate side, and in my organization, very few people think about or know about World Heritage. So I spend a lot of time educating my colleagues about why I'm engaged in the World Heritage work. And I think that we need to expand it from just heritage organizations and IUCN on the conservation side and local organizations to the broader civil society movement. And that comes back to making World Heritage a leverage point for, in my case, gaining climate action as well as heritage protection.
Thank you very much, Adam. I saw one question from our audience, the gentleman there. Would you please introduce yourself briefly? Yeah, our volunteer will hand you over the microphone.
I'm Stefan Dömke, Chair of World Heritage Watch. I would add another question to Adam's. Our experience is that we even have to educate our colleagues from the nature conservation related conventions, from the climate related convention, that the World Heritage is of relevance, that it's not a fancy list drafted by some beauticians in Paris, that it's not a tourism label. It's much more, and to educate the journalists, the media, that it's a part of international law. It's not something just for beauty. I mean, it's also for beauty, but the question is, how do we educate the broader public and the media about the relevance and the responsibility that we all share in maintaining it and preserving the heritage? That is a very practical question for us every day. How do we educate those we want to talk to?
Thank you very much. I think, Adam, would you like to add on? And then I give the floor to Professor Stone.
Okay, thank you. To take up your point, I first got involved in this, in protection of cultural property during armed conflict in 2003. And for the next 8 years, I got it wrong by telling the military and others that what was important was the fact that that was a really important heritage site. What I had to do was learn a completely new language, which was military, and I had to put the importance of the heritage into a military language that made it important for them. And I think that's part of the same issue. Adam and I were on after each other. I was asked to talk about conflict and peace, Adam about climate change. We have already seen the first wars that come from climate change. There are going to be many, many more wars that come from climate change. And we can't, have these things siloed in neat academic presentations. We have to try and grasp them all in the same package. But that's an astonishingly broad and almost impossible, but it can't be impossible, aspiration.
Thank you, Professor Stone. We have Joe back, and we actually echoed your speech and talks in the morning to talk about how could we influence the World Heritage Convention, the system. So maybe you would like to add also a few sentences? This is a question from the audience online.
How can we do it? How can civil society do it?
How can we in general influence the system of World Heritage?
No, it's a good question, and I'm not actually sure that I have an answer for it. Honestly, I think pressure from civil society up to a certain extent can work, because it needs to work at the state party level, at individual countries. If there's enough pressure to sort of move politicians to do something in a certain way, I mean, that could theoretically change the situation. That's one thing. A second thing that could work is if you make it. This is going to sound terribly cynical, and I'm sorry. If you make it in the interests of the World Heritage Committee members, the states parties to the convention, if you present it in a way that they actually think it's going to be to their benefit, I think that would all. And a lot of times that just depends on language. It depends on how you present something. Reducing costs of something of nominations or reducing costs of this, or if you can present it in a way that's actually beneficial to them, I think that's also something that theoretically at least could help to move the needle in one way or another. But again, also keep in mind, this is something, things don't change overnight. I mean, this is actually a process that takes a long time, and so you need to think of it step by step, and you need to think about what step can I do now that's easier, but which will lead to something else that's maybe a little bit more, not radical, but a little bit stronger, 5 years from now. When you need to think about it in those terms. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Yes, that's very helpful. I think we all understand the public awareness building takes a long time, and we need to speak the language our key stakeholders understand and appreciate, also taking their interest into consideration. So this is a very demanding, I would say, but also this is something that we need to do for this.
One other thing, which is beware of unintended consequences, however. Because another thing that happens sometimes, and actually I'll use the televising of the World Heritage Committee as an example. When the idea of televising the World Heritage Committee came about, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, Maxeld or Christina can correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea was that if you're televising it and people can see, if it's broadcast all over the world and people can see how individual committee members are comporting themselves and what arguments they're making and how serious they are about the issues, about the conservation issues, that will, but by televising it, it'll create a positive move. I would actually argue that it's had the opposite effect ultimately, because what it's done is it's given people a platform, a political platform essentially, and so they can play to the camera in a certain way and use words in a certain way, and so my only caution here is just think these things through and think about what you want to achieve and think about what steps that might be, but recognize that there may be unintended consequences, and obviously you can't foresee everything, but I mean think these things through carefully and think about both sides of what could happen before you actually embark on things, because it might make it worse.
Yeah, Matthias?
Well, I was just thinking maybe we can look at how the European Commission is doing things. I mean, they have this public consultation process for major decisions in a quite open way, where they ask not only stakeholders but also the general public. I mean, basically anyone can write. I mean, it's better than nothing. I'm not sure what happens with the input they get, but at least it's a way to formalize things. And
it's a good idea, but you need to convince the committee to institute that. You need to change the operational guidelines to actually institute that. And the bottom line is that those are the people that you ultimately need to convince to change the system. Is those people who maybe don't want to change it. I guess that's the problem.
Yeah, this is a question actually we cannot get conclusions immediately. There will be a long discussion about it. I would like to invite another perspective. If you have any other questions, yes, the lady, please. Can you also briefly introduce yourself before the question?
My name is Claudia Lozano. I'm one of the authors of the book. I'm a sociologist and working as a social anthropologist. I come from the communities. And I was wondering if you didn't think about the convention as a way to talk with the communities, how to make peace, how to make reconciliation, how to make people coming together, because the communities are completely, at least in my experience in Argentina, but in other places in Latin America, people are completely engaged with the places they live. And there is a problem I think it was mentioned this morning about tourism. And the people who are living from tourism are already there, and they are making huge changes. So I think that we have to establish bridges to talk to entrepreneurs, to talk to the communities, to the indigenous peoples. So I would like the people who are transporting the values of the convention to go to the communities, to change the way we communicate and we locate ourselves. If we start from the bottom up, right, we will get very different outcomes, I think. And the problems will be probably greater than they are now, but we have probably we will find some solutions also. So,
thanks for the new perspective. I would ask Matthias to respond to that.
Yeah, I think you brought up a very important point. I mean, the interest of people is the highest when it comes to the specific place where they live. I mean, this is where we already do a lot with public participation, but this is, of course, in a way, an easy entry point to get engaged with the communities. I think, and coming back to what you said, it also depends very much on the narrative that we use. And I mean, we can see a lot of different narratives that are used to explain the World Heritage Convention. Very often it's a conservation-based narrative. Sometimes it's an economy-activated narrative in a sort of a way. But the peace narrative, I think, is especially interesting. We tried to use it in Regensburg early after the Ukraine war, when we made a special newspaper edition, and the only narrative was World Heritage is not about tourism, and it's not mainly about preservation, but it started as a peace project. And the resonance was really good, and I think it was one of the first times that we told the story like that. And of course, the issue, being a site manager in a site, the issue is not that the people are not interested. And the issue is not that there are not good methodologies to involve them. I found, very honest, a big barrier often is the personal attitude of the people working in the local authorities. Because if I don't really believe that the citizens can contribute, if I don't really trust that the citizens are beneficial for the process, then I will do a sort of show involvement, you know, let them decide about the small things, but not about the things that really matter. And this, of course, is a little bit the pink elephant in the room when it comes to personal attitude of the officers responsible for the integration of the communities. I see a lot of obstacles.
Thank you very much, Matthias. And I think the question from our audience here echoes with a question from the online participants. There is one question from our online participants addressed to Anna. They want to, he or she wants to understand, could we hear more on the role of the civil society organizations in Ukraine in protecting World Heritage? So the voice from the local communities.
I think the first thing to clarify here is that nowadays in Ukraine, people are not making distinction between world heritage and cultural heritage as a whole. So we are protecting everything we can, as we should. There is several movements in cultural society nowadays. So there are basically locals, people who work in the museums, and the local volunteers from the areas attached to museums, which are doing a very straightforward work. And by that I mean, if the bomb hits the museum, locals run to museums, try to rescue as many artifacts as possible. Then a more organized body comes in, which is, for example, the initiative I mentioned before, the Heritage Emergency Response Initiative, which united heritage professionals, museums workers, it united Ministry of Culture officials, and it united volunteers from all layers of civil society, who are then trying to do work on a more professional level, so to say. So what they're doing is they for example, document as much as they can all the damage that is happening. They are also sometimes directly involved in the evacuation of the goods. They are open by the means of an online survey to everyone who is interested to basically submit a request. For example, a museum needs packaging material to evacuate their objects, so they're sending this request to HERI, to this initiative, and then they are either looking whether they have some, or they're contacting their international partners, friends, see where something can be delivered, so that the locals on the site can evacuate the objects directly. Another important work is that, of course, they're trying to train people involved in heritage protection. As we all know, the war was unexpected for us, for the whole world, and it was also unexpected for the cultural sector in Ukraine. So the cultural professionals were not prepared, they did not know what to do in such an extreme situation. Plus, a lot of cultural professionals, they moved abroad, whether they had to or they chose to, just to be safe abroad. So the ones who remained were faced with this double load of work, with the stress of war, and with the lack of coordination as to what to do in such a situation. So they are learning as they go, so to say. They are organizing nowadays the training seminars. There has been a lovely conference just a couple of weeks ago organized by Harry, which has been transmitted online. And everyone could, any person could receive a link and follow the conference. And the topic was, what do we do as the civil society with Ukrainian heritage in terms of war? How do we protect it? It was a very interesting conference. Unfortunately, it was all in Ukrainian. Otherwise, you know, I could make advertising for it and for everyone to follow. They also provide technical assistance. By that, we mean the 3D scanning of the objects, digitalizations of museum objects. As I mentioned, some digital cloud space is then made available by the IT companies in Ukraine. So they're trying to combine the modern technology as much as it goes with the traditional conservation practices. The other thing is that a lot of evacuation plans are sensitive information, so unless I'm involved directly, I don't have access to it, and there is also concern for people's safety who are involved in this evacuation, so none of the information is given out until after the evacuation has happened successfully, so to say. And another thing they're doing really well is that they're using social media platforms in a very professional way. Their Facebook page is very well made. They're posting regularly. They are making good use of emojis, of all the right keywords. They are responding to all the comments, and any citizen is free to comment and ask questions, and they're very fast to communicate and to explain what exactly they're doing, why, and what their eventual goal is. So this citizen communication is working really well. So as I see it, the civil society is making the best they can nowadays of the complicated situation. The problem, however, is the lack of coordination, since we are receiving now so many also help offers from all our international friends, which is great. But what we have is that a lot of happening at once everywhere, and not mentioning that the bombs can fall any moment anywhere. So it is very difficult to make long-term plans and to make efficient plans for safeguarding our heritage, just because this unexpectancy is just always hanging in the air.
Thank you very much, Anna. And we can see from what Anna has already told us, and Matthias also shared with us the power of narratives. And so actually, right now, we have digitalization, we have social media, we have new channels of communication. So all these things will bring us new messages, a new possibility, new potentials to communicate with different stakeholders. We should believe in the power of narratives, power of storytelling. And I think this is also part of the potential we need to seize and to make the different people in the civil societies more involved. I hate to stop this discussion and dialogues because it's really vivid and I like to hear different perspectives. I unfortunately have to stop the discussion right now because we're already like 10 minutes late. But thank you very much again for your contributions and also for the participation of our online audience and to bring us a very enlightening dialogues. I hope this dialogue will not just stop here. We will bring the dialogues into the future seminars or activities or even at the private levels. And so this is my hope. And but thanks again for our experts on the podium. And we have to move on to our next session. Thank you.